wanted to express how disgusting and immoral slavery is as a whole, and violates the non-aggression principle. It violates free will and our inherent human rights. And I hope we can all agree that it should be abolished by mankind off of the planet. So having said that, I'm here to present a broader range of slavery that most of us probably don't know about. So I'm starting with China's dynasties, just to give a reference of, this is a race that enslaved their own people. So it started in, the formal institution of slavery started in 2070 BC in China with the Xia dynasty, through the Shang dynasty and the Zhou dynasty. So slavery also lasted for the next 18 dynasties in China until it was abolished in 1910. So through the Xia and Shang dynasty, slavery was very cruel and harsh, and slaves were actually killed along with their masters to serve them in the afterlife. Once we got to the Zhou dynasty, it lightened up based on the rulers of that time period had much more, I guess, laid back policies towards slavery. So it eased up there. So for the next 18 dynasties, slave treatment fluctuated based on rulers' policies of the time. So now we're going to move on to a, I guess, multicultural slavery, where one culture exploited another culture's people. So we move on to the Trans-Saharan Slave Trade. So Arabs began exploiting Africans for labor in the 600s. This is about 1,000 years before Europeans came to Africa. During this time, when boys were captured from ages 8 to 12, they were castrated and sold as eunuchs. So does anyone know what castration is, or what that is?
When you chop off someone's parts.
Yes. So it is the surgical removal. It is the surgical removal of the male penis, including the scrotum and the shaft. So this was done because of Arabs' preconception of African men's promiscuity, and they didn't want them reproducing and spreading their genes throughout the Middle East. So because of because there was no anesthetics or sterilization used, the survival rate of this procedure was less than 10%. So also young women were trudged across the Sahara Desert. They were underclothed, underfed, underwatered through this extremely harsh environment. And most of them died on the route to become slave concubines, where they were basically forcibly married off to men and had to serve them. Any baby born to a slave concubine was usually murdered, again, because they did not want the spread of genetics through their culture. So this would be Arabs capturing, so Arabs would go into Africa and capture them themselves, or buy them from African tribal leaders that had already caught them. These are just some pictures. So, where are the Middle Eastern blacks? So we know that there are a large population of Africans, now African Americans, in the Americas, places such as Brazil, the United States, because slaves were captured, brought over, and they were able to reproduce, and their population grew heavily. But, so it is estimated that Muslims are responsible for enslaving about 150 million Africans. And this is, estimate is on the lower side. And this was throughout their 1,700-year period of the Trans-Saharan Slave Trade. It is also estimated that they are responsible for the deaths of more than 112 million of that 150 million that they enslaved. So this is because many of the boys died from the castration, and the ones that didn't were not able to reproduce anyways. And most women died just on their transportation to Middle Eastern countries, and and their children that they bared were also killed. So then we move on to something most of us know about, I hope so, the transatlantic slave trade. So in 1519, Europeans began to purchase enslaved Africans. Europeans purchased African captives from African tribal leaders. Only about 10 to 15% of Africans survived the 300-plus mile journey that they were led on to the coast by the African tribal leaders. Africans were then taken across the Atlantic Ocean to their destination in the Americas, where about 15 to 25% of them died on this 5,000 plus mile trip. As we know, they were generally treated like human cargo. It was extremely unsanitary, tight quarters, disease was spread, they were going to the bathroom on themselves and other people near them, and the crew generally took advantage of them, especially women and children. So unfortunately, when the transatlantic slave trade, otherwise known as the Western trade, ended, the Eastern or the Trans-Saharan Slave Trade grew at that time. So next we move on to, well, this has to do with warring tribes. So tribes in Africa, they often fought for power and dominance. One African tribe did not see another tribe as their equal, and they were often battling for dominance. When caught by other African tribes, they would be enslaved for labor, or they would be sold as human cargo to the Portuguese, the Arabs, the Northern Europeans, and this is where Europeans get their slaves. Europeans, on average, had an 11-month life expectancy once entering Africa. This was from bug-borne diseases that they were not immune to, animal attacks that they did not know how to fight. So that's why Europeans had to purchase all of their slaves from Africans that had already got them, enslaved them. So here's some perspective. So destinations of enslaved Africans. So as we can see, Europe and Asia only received about 3% of the 10.7 million that were brought over to the Americas. British North America, which would be the United States, only received about 5%. It was about 400,000 to 500,000 went to America as we know it. Portuguese controlled Brazil, that's where 37% of Africans went. Spanish America, that was the parts of America that were controlled by Spain at the time. And the Spanish Caribbean, 15%. Other Caribbean islands, including ones controlled by French and the British, is where 40% of slaves went to. And according to an 1830 U.S. census, 407 African Americans owned slaves just in Charleston, Virginia. About 28% of free African Americans owned slaves in America. So we move on to European slavery. This is also something that many people probably do not know or have heard of regularly. So from 1530 to 1780, North African Muslims kidnapped and enslaved more than 1 million Europeans. This is double the amount that Europeans brought of African slaves to America. European coastal towns and villages were continuously raided by Muslim pirates, and the coasts of European countries were left barren and destroyed because of the pillaging, the raiding, the killing. And next we move on to the Irish slave trade. So this was in Europe. It is actually known that Britain and Scotland especially did not like Ireland. They had always kind of feuded, and they didn't really see Ireland as equal. So British leader James II sold 30,000 Irish prisoners to the New World, and this was including Caribbean islands that were controlled by Europe. And the proclamation of 1625 actually required that Irish prisoners be sold to the West Indies and the Caribbean islands. So this is how Ireland quickly became a large source for cheap labor, and we'll see why in a couple minutes. So from 1641 to 1652, the English sold 300,000 Irish people into slavery and killed about 500,000 more. Husbands were separated from their wives and children, and they were all sold separately to across the Atlantic Ocean. So from an economical standpoint, Africans' lives were far more valued than Irish lives. This was because in the late 1600s, an African slave was worth 50 sterling to a European, and an Irish slave was worth 5. This was because Europeans, they could go into Ireland and take as many slaves as they wanted. It wasn't that hard, but they had to buy Africans from other African tribal leaders that had already caught them. So you're paying for the service. Like if you fix a car part yourself, you're only paying for the part. But if you take it to the shop, you're paying for the service and the part. Not that that's, but you're paying for someone else to do the work. So that's why they were so expensive. So the Irish were generally given the more risky and dangerous jobs because it wasn't as costly if they were hurt or killed. So, the abolition of slavery. So Great Britain actually abolished the slave trade around 1809 and formally abolished it in 1833. In the British Caribbean, it was abolished in 1834, America 1863, Cuba 1886, Brazil 1888, China in 1910, but there was known slavery up until 1949 and even now. Saudi Arabia and Yemen abolished slavery in 1962, Peru in 1968, India in 1976. And these are just a few of large world powers that had slavery. And you could see how late some of them, and there's even slavery we know going on today in some of these places. So yeah. So every continent has seen slavery on its soil. Antarctica being the one exception. It is an economical vantage. It is an economical vantage point that people, when they can, take advantage of. Sadly, it is a power dynamic. So does anyone have any questions about the presentation? I'm interested to know, is there anything new or you haven't heard of?
Castration.
Guess you didn't know what castration was?
No, I didn't know that they did that. So.
Was that the first time ever anyone was hearing about the Trans-Saharan Slave Trade? Has anyone heard of that before? No. Okay, so really quick. So Ms. Garpa posted this on Classroom. It's just like 3 questions just to really make you think about the project. So again, what is something new you learned from this presentation? And why do you think you've never heard about it before? Why do you think you've never heard some of the things that we've learned? How come we haven't learned this in school and things like that? And then the third question that you guys can all look at, and just if you want to discuss with each other or...
Yeah, did you guys want to break up into round table discussion and discuss them? Because it's pretty deep. Want to do round table?
Yeah, better do that.
All right.
That's right here.
All right, you can press stop now.